Hello, my name is Jackson Burns. I'm a student at Sneed State Community College. I'm in Mr. Philip Souther's Psychology 210 online, and this is my Adolescence Assignment. So before we get into the assignment, I'm going to give some key points of what this assignment is going to be about. So puberty is the beginning stage of adolescence, and it is the long process in which an individual will become sexually mature or capable of reproduction. In the first section, because we're going to be breaking this up into two sections, in the first section of the presentation, we'll discuss the physical and cognitive changes that occur during puberty that will eventually lead to sexual maturation. In the second presentation, or second part of the presentation, we will discuss identity and talk about how important it is to an individual during these changes. We will mainly discuss the ideas of Erik Erikson and James Markia. So this part is how the thalamus and the HPA axis initiate puberty. The thalamus is one of the many structures of the brain that plays a humongous role in the initiation of puberty. It begins the process of puberty by excreting a hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH for short, which begins the process of sexual maturation. Once sexual maturation begins, so will the regulation of sex hormones. This is what the hypothalamic pituitary gland, or pituitary gonadal axis, HPG, is responsible for. In Shaista Aslam's article, Endocrine Events Involved in Puberty, a revisit to existing knowledge, she explains puberty initiates by the HPG axis reactivation, which remains dormant after the first 6 months of life. So the HPG axis is actually dormant as soon as you're born. It's active for the first 6 months, and then after the 6 months of life, it goes dormant until puberty hits again. Primary and secondary sex characteristics will also show up as puberty goes on. The definition of these two is primary sex characteristics, explained by Khan Academy's Brooke Miller, is the development of our reproductive organs or the parts of our body that are used for reproduction. So primary sex characteristics only consist of reproductive organs, changes in reproductive organs. And for secondary sex characteristics, she explains that these are non-reproductive characteristics that are related to sexual development but not required for reproduction. And we'll get to some examples down here. So like I said, primary sex characteristics are just influencing reproduction by preparing our reproductive organs for reproduction. Secondary is visible signs that a person is ready or sexually mature, but it doesn't have anything to do with reproduction in itself. Examples of primary for male are testes, and for female, ovaries and uterus. Those are the primary sex characteristics. Secondary examples of secondary sex characteristics for male are facial hair, underarm hair, deepened voice, pubic hair, and things of that nature. For females, it's somewhat the same. The only difference, they develop breast and hips. Both male and female develop underarm hair and pubic hair, and things of that nature for females. So next we're going to look at how hormonal influences changes cognition. So when puberty occurs, it not only affects the physical parts of your body, it affects the cognitive parts as well, like your brain and your thoughts. So due to the surge of hormones being released, your thoughts are undergoing major changes. Piaget explains this change as a shift from straight, concrete thinking into hypothetical, or the ability to think hypothetically, think outside the box per se. So the definition of hypothetical thinking. Our textbook, Lifespan Development, the author, which is Lumen Learning, explains how hypothetical thinking is an advantage in the classroom. As you might suspect, and this is Lumen Learning, this is in our textbook. As you might suspect, students with the ability to think hypothetically have an advantage in many kinds of schoolwork. By definition, they require relatively few props or help to solve problems, and you can find this on page 336. So what this shows is that the flood of hormones caused by puberty is not only affecting our physical changes, it's affecting our mental changes as well, and causing our brains to mature as well, like our bodies maturing. And so one of the changes that happens with puberty is peer interaction changes. So as we all know, because we've all been there, peer interactions will change as you hit puberty. So what you see is that hormones that are being secreted by your brain are affecting the way you see peers. For starters, an individual will develop closer friendships with fewer friends, like cliques, groups, things of that nature, than just being friends with everybody in school. Also, friend groups will become mixed with male and female rather than just boys being friends and girls being friends and split apart. Another peer interaction that changes is romantic relationships. Due to a different kind of hormone being released, you start to get romantic relationships through peer interactions as well. And in this next topic, we're going to talk about the idea of the self. So another change that occurs during puberty is discovering who you are. During this time, individuals will start to shift from rigid, concrete thinking like they did with hypothetical, to developing their own thoughts and beliefs about the world, rather than just what they're told and what their parents tell them, things of that nature. Individuals during this time will also be able to think about the future and the possibilities of how their life will play out. Now, not all thoughts will be their own, because we know that social, home life, culture, things of that nature influence our thoughts and beliefs as well. So next, the impact of physical and cognitive changes leading to sexual maturation. So we just kind of did an overview of how puberty leads to sexual maturation, but we're going to talk about how these physical and cognitive changes leads to sexual maturation. So ultimately, the combination of cognitive and physical changes during puberty help lead to sexual maturation. As we see, the reproductive organs are starting to form and become active, so that leads them to sexual maturation. Secondary sex characteristics are starting to pop up. So before, you didn't have hair, you didn't have a deep voice, you didn't have growth spurts, you didn't have any of that. Now these things are starting to pop up to show that you are ready and prepared for sexual maturation. And finally, the cognitive, which is the secretion of hormones and things of that nature, shifting your peer relations from just friends and boys and girls on one side. You're starting to develop romantic relationships, dating around. That's also a sign of sexual maturation. Not just like when you're in third grade and you have like a little girlfriend that your mom's best friend paired you with. You're starting to actually develop romantic relationships. And for the next section, we're going to be talking about identity versus role confusion. So to understand what this actually is, we got to first revisit the theorist who created the idea, which is Erik Erikson. So our textbook gives us a definition of this stage, and it's when adolescents must work through the complexities of finding one's own identity. That is what identity versus role confusion is. They're gonna work through all the complexities of navigating through school life, jobs, home life, things of that nature, culture, to find their own identity. And you can find this quote on page 349 of our textbook. So during this stage, a person's identity will be influenced by their past and present experiences, along with thinking about what the future might hold. So they're not going to do things in the present that will affect their future, but their past, what they've done in the past, also reflects how they act today. So in order to succeed in this stage, an individual must develop an identity for themselves along with adopting goals for the future. And so there's two parts that affect our identity: our self-concept and our self-esteem. Self-concept is the way a person develops their own ideas and beliefs. So an individual has many possible identities they can choose between, in which they will weigh the consequences of choosing a particular identity based on what the future might hold. Once the individual has picked an identity, they'll portray behavior of that identity and stray away from all other behaviors that do not align with the identity that they've chosen. And on this other side, self-esteem. Self-esteem is the view individuals have of themselves, not necessarily their beliefs or ideas. It's what they view themselves as. So during this time of adolescence, puberty, many factors influence an individual's self-esteem, and self-esteem can fluctuate based on those factors. These factors do differ between girls and boys. So with girls, their self-esteem kind of aligns more higher with the more friends they have. So the more friendships they develop, the higher they feel their self-esteem is. With boys, on the other hand, the way they gauge their self-esteem is based on the romantic relationships they have. So whether or not they're doing well romantically with their relationships will determine how high or low their self-esteem is. And so there are a couple areas that make up our identity that some developmentalists have outlined. So the areas described in our textbook are religious, political, vocational, ethnic, and gender identity. In the case of religious identity, most of the time individuals will pair religious identity with what their parents practice. So whatever religion the parents practice will most likely be passed back down to the child of the parents. There are rare cases where the child does not practice the same religion, but most of the time a child will practice the same religion as their parents. Same thing with political. Whatever political party your parents identify with, a child will typically go or lean more towards that political party. Same thing with religious. There are rare cases where a child will rebel or not follow that same political party. The next is vocational. The vocational identity is one that takes the longest to develop. A reason for that, which our textbook explains, is vocational identity takes longer to develop as most of today's occupations require additional education or are required on the job itself, like an internship. So you don't automatically develop a vocational identity right off the bat. You typically have to stay with the job for a long time or take part in an apprenticeship to actually gain a vocational identity. Next is ethnic identity, and that refers to how a person identifies themselves based on their ethnic or racial background. Our textbook does outline that minorities or minority groups typically find this more prevalent in figuring out or developing an individual identity. So typically minority groups will align more with their ethnic identity than non-minority groups. Finally, gender identity is the way an individual views their self-perception of their sex. And this can be confused with biological sex. It's not the same thing in theory. The difference between the two is that gender can be changed based on what a person feels comfortable or uncomfortable with in what they are assigned. So sex is biological, male or female. Gender can be basically whatever a person feels comfortable with. And these are the four ideas or theories that James Markia outlined in our textbook on establishing identity. So achievement is basically what it sounds like. This is the stage in which an individual has seen a bunch of different identities that they might align themselves with, and they've picked one and have made a commitment about it. Moratorium is when an individual is still exploring an identity or trying to find themselves, but they're trying new things in that nature, but they have not found something that's just stuck with them yet. Foreclosure is when an individual does not try anything else. They just pick one and they don't try anything else out. They just pick an identity and that's it. And finally, we have diffusion. Diffusion is when a person's they're not trying to find themselves and they haven't picked one either. So they're basically doing nothing in this stage. And these are all the works cited, the sources that I used for this project. Thank you.